You know what? I'm telling you now that my opinion is fact and that surprises stink. That's right, I said it. Who likes surprises? The overwhelming majority of you? Well, surprises stink because you don't have control over the situation. And what if the surprise is like 90% great, but 10% not quite what you want? It's like you're excited, you just got something awesome, and that 10% is still bugging you, but you don't want the person giving you the surprise to know, so you gotta fake it. Look, me personally, I would rather just know what's coming. Wouldn't you want to know what life is going to be like? What the rules are? Well, some of you would rather just know, and others of you are like, give me the surprise. In today's passage in Genesis 3, that's exactly what we're going to see, so let's get into it. Well, hey there, I'm Dominic, and Lighthouse is a youth ministry at Austin Chinese Church where we desire for every student to personally experience the light of Christ and for students to shine the light of Christ into your spheres of influence. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. And if you're not subscribed to the Lighthouse channel, hit the subscribe button right now. If you haven't watched last week's video, you can click the I in the upper corner. Today we will conclude our time in Genesis 3. If you're not familiar with the book of Genesis, Genesis chapter 3 is a chapter where Adam and Eve and sin is introduced to the world. But more importantly, where sin is introduced to the human condition. On our prior two lessons on Genesis 3, we focused on what sin is, how it was introduced to the human heart, and why sin ruins every relationship that we have. And we also saw last time how in response to Adam and Eve's sin, God delivers a judgment against Adam and Eve because God has to separate himself from sin because he is perfect, he is holy, and cannot accept sin, let alone be near it. And so he evicts Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. Now, if Genesis 3 just ended at verse 19, all of humanity would be left without any hope and opportunity to resolve our sin problem. But here's the amazing thing. Did you know that the gospel is present in Genesis 3? Yep, that's right. And that's exactly what we're going to see today. Last time we were in Genesis 3, we focused our attention on the role of God's judgment. We talked about how God is in charge, a price must be paid for sin, that God is holy, and that there will be severe consequences for men and women because of their disobedience. The gospel is the story of God who is holy and perfect and who made everything, addressing the sin of humanity, providing a solution to humanity's sin problem by sending his son, Jesus Christ, to live a sinless life, die an unjust death in our place, and to rise from the grave to give people the opportunity for eternal life. And so today, we're going to focus in on God's grace that's on display in Genesis 3. We can define grace from God as God's goodness to those who deserve punishment for their sins. And that's exactly what Adam and Eve deserve for not obeying God's commands. First of all, God shows grace to Adam, Eve, and all humanity by not killing them on the spot in response to their sin and disobedience to him. If you know the story of Noah, you'll remember that sin was pervasive amongst all of humanity. And God was so disgusted by all the sin that he witnessed that he considered wiping out all of humanity. Now, you can take that to different conclusions, but I think what's most important to take away is that it is within God's capability and within God's right to do so if he was to so wish. But the story of the entire Bible is God showing grace to humanity when we really deserve punishment. And when God punishes men and women, God's punishment is actually a restrained response because their price that was paid for sin is not their lives immediately on the spot. Instead, God allows for Adam and Eve to start a family as we see in Genesis 4:1. Instead, God takes Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden, the sanctuary, remember, and the place where they have direct access, fellowship and worship and relationship to God, where all these things exist, and God separates them outside the walls of the garden, indicating the change in their relationship, the broken relationship that still exists between God and humanity today. You see, the rules that God had laid out were known by Adam and Eve. They knew what was coming if they didn't obey God. Now, the surprise is what God does next. In verse 20, God clothes Adam and Eve with animal skins. What's so significant about this? Well, a number of things. First of all, God kills animals to provide skin garments or clothes for Adam and Eve. The death of the animal represents that the solution to sin requires a substitute on our behalf that we need provided to us externally and placed upon ourselves. This is the literal expression of the gospel that we just talked about. Second, God recognizes the clothing problem that they had to address their nakedness, and God solves it by giving them full-length clothes. Now, I realize that this isn't readily available to us as we read the passage that we see garments of skin. The literal translation here is tunics of skin. So, in other words, this is a piece of clothing that goes all the way down to your knees or your ankles. Remember, back in verse 7, when Adam and Eve sinned, they tried to sew leaves together, and then they basically made a belt in order to try to cover up their private parts. And God sees them, and in His compassion and in His grace, God knows what they've done, what they've tried to do to solve their own sin problem is insufficient. And His love and grace abounds by making them full-length clothing so that they could properly cover themselves. And if what God had done wasn't already enough, God does even more and goes even more out of His way. Lastly, in verse 19, it says that God clothed them, but the verb for clothe them isn't just a basic, I'm going to put on some normal everyday clothing. It has two primary uses, and while they're different, I don't think the specific details matter so much as getting the big idea. And the big idea is this, that the word clothed can either mean the clothing that kings would give to honored subjects, or it was for dressing the clothes that the Jewish priests for their sacred clothing. Look, either way, what we see is that God gives Adam and Eve, and all humanity by extension, what God has already done. Humanity is different from every other living creature who He loves dearly and extends grace to humanity when we didn't deserve anything from God aside from death. This surprise is important for us to acknowledge. It's surprising that God continues to love and show Adam and Eve grace. They had one rule to follow, and they disobeyed it. So God followed His own rules. He judges their sin and removes them from the place of worship. But in doing so, God previews that He will provide a substitute for us. God will provide a solution to our sin problem in the person of Jesus. And this is why Genesis 3 is so amazing. At the moment of the worst thing humanity could have ever done, God immediately, surprisingly, and graciously steps in with a solution. So I take it back. Surprises aren't so bad after all. Genesis 3 wraps up with a hope and a future when it seemed like there was none. For those in the Asian and Asian American community, we continue to witness racist acts towards our community that break our heart, like the attack on Vilma Kari, a 65-year-old female immigrant from the Philippines in New York City, when doorman just shut the door on her. Just because we have some space from the murders in Atlanta and the attacks on the elderly in the Bay Area doesn't mean it's just gone away. I know some of you feel like you haven't really experienced anti-Asian racism, while others of you know exactly what it's like to be discriminated against. So I'd like for us to return to our conversation with Mary, Janie, and Jolene, because just like we saw in Genesis 3, God has graciously and surprisingly redeemed sin to help these three godly women understand who God is and how He has made them in the image of God. When we read Genesis 3, we saw sin, judgment, and today, grace. It is within God's grace that I want us to lean into their conversation about racism, sexism, and discrimination and see how God will work all things for His greater good. This is the second half of our conversation, and your counselor has the link to the video. Wrap up the rest of the video by watching the announcements and the conclusion, then watch the second half of our conversation and keep the tab open so you can go through the discussion questions as a small group. Here are today's discussion questions for you to discuss in your small group. First, how did Dominic define what grace is? Second, in what ways do you see God's grace shown in Genesis 3? Third, what did you take from the second half of our conversation with Asian American women? Fourth, share an experience when you were subjected to racism. How did that experience make you feel, and how did you respond? How has God redeemed your racist experience to help you better understand why God has made you the way you are? Everyone is invited to join our senior banquet that has been rescheduled. That's right, rescheduled for April 25th at 6 p.m. The Zoom link can be found in your email to join. Everyone is welcome to join in and celebrate how God has brought our seniors through the last 7 years and is readying them for the next stage of their lives. I can't wait to see everyone at Senior Banquet. Can you imagine what your small group would have been like without a committed counselor like the one that you have right now? To be there for you every weekend, to show up when being on Zoom and Hangouts is exhausting, to invest in you, to pray for you, to point you to the gospel. Well, we're going to thank and celebrate our counselors on Sunday, May 6th at 1 p.m. over Zoom. We want to do this through two primary ways. First, by sharing how they've shaped and influenced you over the past year, and second, by giving them a gift. You'll have a maximum of 8 minutes to share with everyone how your counselor has been amazing over the past year. As a small group, you'll need to do a few things. First, make sure you have each other's email addresses so you can plan for counselor appreciation together. Second, plan and prepare what you'd like to say to express your appreciation to your counselor. You can make a video, a presentation, something else, or just share in the moment. And third, you need to come up with a gift idea that would be meaningful for your counselor to receive from you as a small group. Now, remember, your counselor can buy anything you might purchase them, but they can't buy something meaningful that only you as a small group can give to them. It doesn't have to be costly, though I'm sure they wouldn't be opposed to it. It just needs to be meaningful and personal. Now, if you have two counselors, you should prepare two gifts. Then decide who is going to do what and to buy what, and make sure everyone pays evenly. You still have a number of weeks to prepare. I'm excited to see everyone gather together to see and hear how you've been blessed by your counselor this year at Counselor Appreciation. Hey, thanks so much for joining us today and seeing God's surprising response to sin. My prayer for you is that today's lesson shows how God takes sin seriously. While we are judged for our sin, He also provides a solution to our sin. As you listen to the women who share their thoughts and reflections, I hope you felt encouraged to know that you are not alone in experiencing racism and sexism. God's grace, compassion, and a glimpse of the gospel that gives us hope that is manifested and perfected in the person, work, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. In faith, I believe there is something deeply influential and powerful that God wants us to take away from Genesis 3 today. Make sure to stay connected with us throughout the week online at acclighthouse.org and on Instagram at acclighthouse. Have a great week, and I'll see you in our next video.